Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Wobble Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to do a short podcast, bringing you up to date on the negotiations that have been taking place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, this week. Part of the Trump peace plan, if we can call it that, whereby we go through a step-by-step procedure of putting in place small-scale interim ceasefires with a view to having a more more universal ceasefire, and then eventually to a long-standing, enduring ceasefire. So that seems to be the Trump idea. If you recall, the first idea was to have a 30-day ceasefire on all fronts, or land, sea, and air. This was turned down by Russia for the obvious reason that there were no restrictions on Ukraine continuing to receive arms, on Ukraine continuing to mobilize, on Ukraine continuing to train its forces. So the Russians turned that down very politely, but nonetheless they turned it down. And then Trump talked about maybe a 30-day ceasefire on energy infrastructure, and that's still under discussion, as well as a 30-day ceasefire in the Black Sea. Now, that's a very interesting situation because there really isn't any kind of a fighting going on in the Black Sea. However, there was indeed a real issue over grain exports from Ukraine through the Black Sea and through the Turkish Straits. And there were a number of negotiations that took place in 2022 and 2023, whereby Ukraine would be allowed to export its grain through the Black Sea and into the Turkish Straits. However, the problem that the Russians raised was that, well, they can go through with their grain, but then when they come back, the empty ships come back, they're bringing into Ukraine armaments from NATO countries. And so they said, well, that's not really acceptable to us. So there were a lot of discussions about how one can have the so-called Black Sea Grain Initiative, whereby Ukraine would be able to get its grain out, but there would be some inspection mechanism in place to ensure that the empty ships returning to Ukraine are not carrying weapons for Ukraine. And there seemed to be a Black Sea grain deals done, brokered by the Turkish President Erdogan, but they fell through. And one of the reasons they fell through was that there was a corollary that the Russians had insisted on, which is that, well, they'd be happy to allow Ukraine to export its grain and make money on its grain exports, but Russia would then expect the same, that Russia would also be able to export its grain, its foodstuffs, and its fertilizers, and not be subject to sanctions. And that was all the negotiations that had taken place during 2022 and 2023 were supposed to fulfill the two parts of the deal. Ukraine gets to export its grain. A mechanism is put in place to ensure that they're not bringing in contraband into Odessa and other Black Sea ports, but at the same time, Russia would be able to export its grains, its fertilizers, and that means that the various sanctions that were in place on Russia's agricultural bank, the on insurance rates, all of that, and of course, above all, Russia's banning from the SWIFT system. That would all be removed, and therefore Russia would be able to make money on its grain exports, and Ukraine would be able to make money. But that never came to fruition, and so the Black Sea Grain Initiatives actually fell apart. Ukraine has been able to use the Black Sea ports to export its grain and go through the Turkish Straits, but its ships have stuck fairly close to the western shores of the Black Sea, and they haven't been attacked by Russia. So the revival of the Black Sea Grain Initiative is a little surprising, because there'd been so many negotiations over the years, and without any real resolution of this problem. But nonetheless, the Russians and the Ukrainians separately met the Americans in Saudi Arabia and discussed this, as well as the second part of Trump's interim ceasefires, which is to discuss how the ceasefire on the energy infrastructure can be implemented. So they negotiated on Monday and Tuesday, and then on Tuesday, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine separately issued their readouts of the agreements reached, or rather what the state of play is in their negotiations. So let's just go through the individual readouts, which are similar, but nonetheless, there are definitely differences among them. So let's first look at the Russian readout about what was decided in Riyadh. And here, let me pull this up. And this is the main results of the meeting of expert groups of Russia and the USA. And then it says, in accordance with the agreement between the presidents of Russia and the United States, the Russian and American sides agreed to ensure the implementation of the Black Sea Initiative, which includes ensuring the safety of navigation in the Black Sea, non-use of force, and prevention of the use of commercial vessels for military purposes, while organizing appropriate control measures through inspection of such vessels. So this goes back, as I said, to the issue that the Russians had raised before, which was that once Ukraine got its grain out, those empty ships returning to Ukraine's Black Sea ports would come with weapons, and therefore the Russians would to say, well, we can't just allow them to unload weapons from NATO countries. So that's why, commercial vessels for military purposes, while organizing appropriate control measures through inspection of such vessels. And then 2, the United States will help restore access for Russian agricultural and fertilizer exports to the world market, reduce the cost of marine insurance, and expand access to ports and payment systems to conduct such transactions. So this again was an integral part of the negotiations over these Black Sea grain initiatives in 2022, 2023, which was that the Russians wanted the lifting of some of the sanctions so they could sell their agricultural and fertilizer products. And so reduce the cost of marine insurance and expand access to ports and payment system. Ports, because a number of the European states, the European NATO states, said, well, you can't use our ports for any unloading of any of your food products, and then of course that real problems finding insurance for the vessels, and the payment system is of course was key, because how else is Russia going to get paid for its exports? And so that's why the Russians say, and this is in the readout, note, paragraphs 1 and 2 shall come into force after. So in other words, this will be conditioned on the lifting of sanctions, restrictions from Bank, which is the agricultural bank, and other financial organizations involved in ensuring operations on international trade in food products, including fish products and fertilizers, connecting them to SWIFT, opening the necessary correspondent accounts. So they're saying that there's points 1 and 2, essentially the agreement, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, can only come into force if sanctions, restrictions on Russia's agricultural bank and other financial organizations involved in ensuring operations on international trade in food products is lifted, and there's a connection connecting to SWIFT, and opening the necessary correspondent accounts. And then lifting restrictions on trade, finance, and transactions, lifting sanctions restrictions on companies producing and exporting food, including fish products and fertilizers, as well as lifting restrictions on the work of insurance companies with cargoes of food. So in other words, unless there are serious moves on the lifting on sanctions and restrictions on Russia's ability to sell its agricultural products and its fertilizers, then there's no deal. There's no Black Sea grain deal. Pretty much they're saying we got our fingers burned before when we negotiated and negotiated and negotiated, and the West never lifted any of those restrictions. And then it says lifting restrictions on servicing ships in ports and sanctions against ships under the Russian flags involved in trade in food products. And then lifting restrictions on the supply of agricultural machinery to the Russian Federation. So, lifting those sanctions as well on the supply of agricultural machinery. That's a big one, because, they're always going to say, hey, these are dual use technology, but again, Russians are insisting on this, so that's the condition for their return to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, lifting restrictions as well as other goods used in the production of food. So pretty much any agricultural machinery and production of food and fertilizers. And then this is again, so those are the conditions the Russians are insisting on that have to be fulfilled in order to return to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And then 3, the United States agreed to develop measures to implement the agreements between the presidents of the 2 countries on a ban on strikes on energy facilities. So they're going to discuss the measures to implement the agreements for a period of 30 days, starting on March the 18th, which is very strange because there's no agreement in place yet. But the clock essentially started running on March the 18th. So now we're eight days on. So there are still 22 days to go on an agreement that doesn't exist yet. With the possibility of extension. Now, of course, if they come to an agreement, they can extend it, but the clock has already started running on a deal that is basically is non-existent, with the possibility of extension and the withdrawal from the agreement in the event of non-compliance by one of the parties. And then Russia and the United States welcome good officers from third countries and Russia and the United States will continue to work to achieve a strong and lasting peace. And then the Russians later in the day published a list of the Russian and Ukrainian energy facilities that fall under the temporary moratorium on attacks on the energy system. So that the very deal that's supposed to have started on March the 18th, so the Russians published this list, but they are claiming that these were agreed upon by the Russian and the American sides. Oil refineries, so no attacks on oil refineries. 2, oil and gas pipelines and storage facilities, including pumping stations, so no attacks on oil and gas pipelines. 3, electricity generation and transmission infrastructure, including power plants, substations, transformers, and distributors. And then no attacks on nuclear power plants, no attacks on hydroelectric dams. And then the temporary moratorium is valid for 30 days, again, starting from March the 18th, may be extended by mutual agreement. In the event of the violation of the moratorium by one of the parties, the other party has the right to consider itself free from obligations to comply with it. Okay, so that's the Russians. So there's 2 separate documents that the Russians presented. They said these are the conditions for our returning to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, fairly extensive list of what they want, and above all, the lifting of the sanctions on pretty much sanctions restricting their ability to sell their agricultural products, and then the list of energy targets that are to be prohibited from attack. Anyway, this was the American statement. It says outcomes of the United States and Russia expert groups on the Black Sea. And then here again, this was the negotiations, and the Americans say the United States and Russia have agreed to ensure safe navigation, eliminate the use of force, and prevent the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea. Yeah, that's in the Russian readout. And then the United States will help restore Russia's access to the world market for agricultural and fertilizer exports, lower maritime insurance costs, and enhance access to ports and payment systems for such transactions. So the United States is promising that it will help restore Russia's access to the world market for agricultural and fertilizer exports. So obviously they're not going into the details that the Russians went into, and we just read that out. So but they're saying we will help to restore Russia's access. Now, there's a real problem there, which is that these promises have been made before to the Russians. It's not even clear that the Trump administration or the people at the top of the Trump administration will be able to get around any resistance from within to lifting these restrictions. This goes all really way down, very deep down in the bowels of the U.S. government. So that's obviously is a real question. That again, there were pledges made before, and then they were never followed through. But there's the other aspect of it is that, well, the Europeans are quite unlikely to go along with this. So, any talk of bringing the Russians back into the SWIFT system will almost certainly be met with ferocious resistance in Europe. So even if the U.S. government, all throughout all levels of the U.S. government would be happy to help lift the sanctions and restrictions on Russia, it's really very, very questionable whether they'll be able to persuade the Europeans to go along with this. And then it goes on, the United States and Russia agreed to develop measures for implementing President Trump's and Putin's agreement to ban strikes against energy facilities of Russia and Ukraine. The United States and Russia welcomed the good offices of third countries with a view toward supporting the implementation of the energy and maritime agreements. And then the United States and Russia will continue to work towards achieving a durable, lasting peace. So it's a very brief, terse statement from the Americans, nowhere near as detailed as the Russian one. And then here we have, where are we? Yeah. And then again, this is the United States reiterated that that Donald Trump's imperative that the killing on both sides of the Russia-Ukraine conflict must stop as the necessary step towards achieving an enduring peace settlement. To that end, the United States will continue facilitating negotiation between both sides to achieve a peaceful resolution in line with agreements made in Riyadh. So that's an interesting, they insert this paragraph as maybe a marker, they're putting down a marker saying, well, Donald Trump is committed to ending the killing on both sides, which means that if he doesn't get his way and the killing continues, he might get very upset. I mean, that's the only thing that a reason I can understand for why they would insert this paragraph in, that he's saying, well, for the time being, I'm trying to facilitate a peace deal because I want the killing to stop. But there may come a point at which I will get fed up with this, and I will feel that my attempts are not being treated with respect. And at that point, it's anybody's guess which way he's going to turn. So this is the statement that the Americans issued as to their negotiations with the Ukrainians, which were also in Riyadh. And then here we have the in line with the presidential level discussions between President Trump and President Zelensky, the United States facilitated bilateral technical level talks with the Ukrainian delegation. Following these discussions, the United States and Ukraine have agreed to ensure safe navigation, eliminate the use of force, and prevent the use of commercial vessels for military purposes in the Black Sea. So that's exactly the same as the statement in the Russia agreement. The United States and Ukraine agreed that the United States remains committed to helping achieve the exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilian detainees, and the return of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. So this is clearly different from anything that the United States agreed to with the Russians. So they suddenly bring up prisoners of war, the release of civilian detainees, and then they're bringing up the Ukrainian children, which were, of course, brought up last week, both in Trump's discussion with Zelensky and were brought up by Waltz and Rubio's discussions with the Ukrainians also in Saudi Arabia. So suddenly this has become an issue, which it hadn't been before, about the transferred Ukrainian children, which the ICC had used as the basis for issuing an arrest warrant against President Putin. The United States and Ukraine agreed to develop measures for implementing President Trump and President Zelensky's agreement to ban strikes against energy facilities of Russia and Ukraine. So that's still part of these ongoing negotiations, though there isn't the time limit that the Russians had said. The clock started running on March the 18th, and basically it's going to be just for 30 days. But there's no time limit here. The United States and Ukraine welcome the good offices of third countries, and then the United States and Ukraine will continue to working towards a durable and lasting peace. And then again, the same statement as in the Russian agreement, the United States reiterated to both sides President Donald Trump's imperative that the killing must stop as the necessary step towards achieving an enduring peace settlement. So clearly, that's an important statement that the Americans insisted on, that and suggesting really that Trump's patience is not infinite. Anyway, then Rustem Umerov, who's the Ukrainian defense minister, presented what is the Ukrainian readout of this agreement. It says Ukraine and the United States held bilateral technical consultations in Riyadh, focused on the security of energy and critical infrastructure, safe navigation of the Black Sea, the release of our prisoners and children. Fulfilling the task of the president of Ukraine, we continue to work on bringing a just peace and ensuring security for our country. This meeting is a logical extension of the successful consultations with the United States in Jeddah. That, if you recall, that took place last week with Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio. No one wants a just peace more than Ukrainians, and our position remains honest, transparent, and consistent. And then key outputs, all parties have agreed to ensure safe navigation, eliminate the use of force, prevent the use of commercial vessels for military purpose in the Black Sea. Important, the Ukrainian side emphasizes that all movements by Russia of its military vessels outside the eastern part of the Black Sea will constitute a violation of the spirit of this agreement, will be regarded as a violation of the commitment to ensure safe navigation of the Black Sea and a threat to the national security of Ukraine. In this case, Ukraine will have the full right to exercise the right of self-defense. So that didn't appear at all in the American readout of the Ukraine agreement, American readout of the Russian agreement, and it certainly didn't appear in the Russian readout of the American agreement. So this is something that the Ukrainians inserted, claiming that any movement by the Russians of its military vessels outside of its eastern part, so they're not even engaged in any military operations against Ukraine, just any other movement outside the eastern part of the Black Sea will constitute a violation of the spirit of this agreement. And in this case, Ukraine will have the full right to exercise the right to self-defense. So that's the saying. Well, we have the right, basically to walk away from this agreement. So it doesn't appear in any of the other statements. This is something that the Ukrainians have thrown in as a basis for that they could just walk away from this deal. And then all parties agreed to develop measures for implementing the president's agreement to ban strikes against energy facilities. All parties welcome the good offices of third countries with a view to supporting the implementation of the energy and maritime agreements. All parties continue working towards durable and lasting peace. With Ukraine, the U.S. reiterated its support to help achieve the exchange of prisoners, release of civilian detainees, and the return of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. And then for the effective implementation agreement, important to hold additional technical consultations as soon as possible to agree on all the details of technical aspects of the implementation and so on. And I think that's it. So we look now at essentially we had the Russian agreement, the Russian readout of its agreement with the United States. Then we had the Russian statement about the energy infrastructure installations that are to be off limits during this ceasefire, which hasn't begun, but which they're negotiating. But those they say that the Americans have agreed that those energy infrastructure targets are off limits. Then we had the Americans issuing two separate statements, the result of their negotiation with the Russians, the negotiations with the Ukrainians, and then we had the Ukrainian readout of its deal with the United States. So to be honest, when one's looking at it, that it's very hard to see how all of this is going to add up to, at the very least, a 30-day ceasefire on land, sea, and air. These are piecemeal interim ceasefires, which are quite possible, though by no means attainable. The Russians have certainly imposed quite severe conditions for them to go along with a ceasefire in the Black Sea. But to be honest, it's not such a big deal because there really isn't a war going on in the Black Sea. And Ukraine is able to ship its grain out through the Turkish Straits without any real attack from the Russians, and the Russians are not boarding Ukrainian ships to inspect for contraband. So that isn't happening. So it's hard to see what this Black Sea Grain Initiative would achieve. Now, the Russians obviously would like, understandably, that some of the sanctions and restrictions on their agricultural exports removed. Seems unlikely to be done. I mean, it's unlikely the Americans are going to go along with it, and it's a near certainty that the Europeans will not agree to lift the restrictions on Russia's agricultural bank and to allow Russia to return to the SWIFT system. So that seems unlikely. But on the other hand, it's not a big deal. There really isn't a war going on in the Black Sea. The energy infrastructure negotiations, that might still get somewhere. It seems there's a interest on both sides and on the American side to come to some kind of an agreement, and that may well happen. But the longer term ceasefire is a long way off, and even that 30-day ceasefire is a long way off, because ultimately the Russians have explicitly stated the conditions which must be fulfilled for them to agree to a 30-day universal ceasefire, which is that they can't allow NATO to go on arming Ukraine in the interim. They certainly cannot allow NATO personnel to be helping train Ukrainians. And without that, then it's hard to see what incentive Russia has to agree to a ceasefire. So there remains the unknown, which we saw what the Americans have inserted into their agreements with the Russians and the Ukrainians. You know, President Trump's patience is not infinite. He will decide at some point whether his attempt to come to a ceasefire have been worth it or not. And if he decides that they haven't been worth it, and then he is going to decide who's more to blame, and he will act accordingly. So we're still in this kind of interim kind of period, so to say, of goodwill, whereby the United States is trying to bring peace to Ukraine, but the peace, as things stand, is a long way off. So anyway, that's an update. You know, maybe there'll be more developments later on in the week. And thank you very much for joining me. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon.